Chapter 76, The Palace. As soon as Song Shuren opened his mouth, the crowd knew what was going on. It turned out that these people were all characters who were begging for a living on the streets of Kyoto at night. After Song Shuren's interrogation, these people respectfully confessed that they had once seen Fan's sedan chair coming out of King Jing's residence yesterday, and did not return to the residence, but instead headed to the west side of the city, and then, in the middle of the night, it was mysteriously lifted back up again. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly as he looked at the scene, somewhat admiring the Guo family's ability to find all these people who had once seen him in half a day's time. Jing Tuof saw that he wasn't worried. His heart was a little anxious, and he lowered his voice and said, "Stay dead silent. Just say that these people were bought by the Guo family with money." Fan Xian sighed and said, "Guo Baoquan was indeed beaten, and his injuries are so tragic. Could it be that he spent money on so many things just because he wanted to wrong me? It doesn't make sense in terms of reasoning." Jing Tuof couldn't imagine that the eldest young master would actually consider on the enemy's side, and froze for a moment. At this time, a hint of mockery floated up from the corner of Song Shuren's lips as he looked at Fan Xian. "Wasn't Mr. Fan in the mansion last night? Why did so many people in Kyoto once see that you did not return to your residence, and may I ask what Mr. Fan was doing in the middle of the night when he was roaming the streets of Kyoto in the middle of the night, needing to be so sneaky?" Kyoto Prefect Mei Jili frowned at Fan Xian to see how he was going to answer. There was silence in the public hall. Fan Xian sighed, more than a hint of embarrassment on his face, a hint of the awkward smile of someone else discovering a secret, and softly replied, "Last night I spent the night at the Drunken Immortal Residence." The Drunken Immortal Residence was a place that everyone knew well, and as soon as they thought that this young master had spent the night in a greenhouse, there seemed to be a reasonable explanation for him to be acting so furtively, and the crowd of onlookers let out a chorus of ohs and laughed in unison, which naturally did not fail to include some mocking sentences about Fan Xian. Mei Jili heard this explanation but breathed a sigh of relief, while Song Shuren still smiled and asked, "Drunken Immortal Residence? Dare I ask if Mr. Fan has any witnesses?" "Miss Shirley can testify," Fan Xian said with some embarrassment. Song Shuren paused and suddenly laughed mockingly. "Is that so? But Miss Sirilili has already left Kyoto today and traveled to Suzhou. This matter is a bit too coincidental. I wonder if someone is afraid that Miss Sirilili will say something she shouldn't say." Fan Xian raised his head, his eyes staring at Song Shuren. Then he realized that Guo Fu didn't know what tactics had been used to force that Miss Siri out of Kyoto, and it seemed that the other party had prepared for it. Seeing that he was speechless, Song Shuren became a mastermind and saluted Lord Mei. "The matter is already very clear. Duke Fan hit the person first, and the false confessions came later. Please ask Your Honor to escort this prisoner to prison for trial." Jing Tuo, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly laughed. "What a grandiose way to put it. Is it because my young master went on a night outing that he should be planted with such a great offense?" Song Shuren pressed, "Since Mr. Fan went on a trip, may I ask why Mr. Fan said that Mr. Fan stayed in the mansion all night earlier?" Jing Tuo answered freely, "This sleeps with the flowers and sleeps with the willow. The reputation is always bad, so earlier I had no choice." Song Shuren cut off his words with a smile. "Sleeps with the flowers and sleeps with the willow? Now this flower where? And where is the willow?" He arched his hand to the surroundings, and said aloud, "Guo Gongzi and Fan Gongzi the day before yesterday, last night, was attacked. The thieves arrogantly admitted that Fan idle Fan Gongzi last night, but not back all night, but cannot say where to go. Ask who is the real culprit. Is not it a clear thing?" Mei Jili coldly looked at this counselor, thinking that this kind of case, even if you say the sky to go, do you still really think it is a general criminal lawsuit? Inevitably, he looked down a few levels on this famous rich mouth and turned his head to ask, "Fan Xian, do you have any corroborating evidence as to your whereabouts last night?" Fan Xian thought for a moment and smiled. "Actually, yesterday, I went fooling around with King Jing's son. I don't know if this counts as a witness. Since King Jing's son is involved, this case is still reviewing a fart." Mei Jili, full of black gas, while both sides of the people shouted to the front, whispered a few words. "What? then declared that this case temporarily ended. Fan Xian stayed in the capital to wait for the investigation, is not allowed to go out of the city. Guo family naturally do not do, but the other side of this witness weight is too heavy, a time there is no way, had to go back to the house for further discussion. The people of Kyoto, who were watching, realized that it was such a boring ending, and that both the minister's family and the minister's family ended without much fuss, and dispersed after a coaxing sound. When Fan Xian and Zheng Tuo walked out of the government office, they were somewhat surprised to find that Song Shiren was waiting for them outside. "Mr. Fan." Song Shiren smiled and saluted. Fan Xian did not know what he meant and returned the salute. Song Shiren said softly, "The Guo family has been kind to me, so I have no choice but to apologize today." Fan Xian suddenly thought of a tsunami and asked with a frown, "Is it true that Miss Shiren has left Kyoto?" Once Song Shiren was out of the public hall, he looked incredibly respectful when he looked at this noble gentleman again and answered yes. Fan Xian stared into his eyes and asked, "Did you do it, or did the Guo family do it?" Song Shiren was a bit surprised and said, "I had thought that Mr. Fan had sent her out of the capital. Could it be that you were really at the drunken immortal residence last night?" Fan Xian laughed bitterly. "Could it be that you really thought it was me who beat up Guo Baokuan?" At this time, the case had come to an end for the time being, but the two sides were still talking a little too much. After a few words, Song Shiren turned around and boarded a small soft ride, leaving the Kyoto government offices. Fan Xian looked over there and wondered, why come back to show goodwill when you've already been offended? Song Shiren is a smart man. Zheng Tuo shook his head with a smile and said softly, "Young master didn't say that he was drinking flowery wine with Prince Jing in the mansion. Song Shiren played such a trick that he almost didn't scare me to death." Fan Xian smiled. "We all know that the public court is nothing more than a passing phase. Why so nervous?" Zheng Tuo shook his head and sighed. "Regardless of how this develops later, it's considered to have offended the Guo family. Always have to offend people, simply pick a can offend a little. Young master, your flower name and poem name are estimated to spread throughout Kyoto within a day. Surely I wish to do so, but I dare not invite my ears. Admirable admiration. You're welcome." In the heavy deep palace, the yellow glazed tiles are flooded with golden light under the sunlight, and the vermilion high wall gives birth to a sense of oppression for no reason. In the garden behind the palace, a kindly old lady is listening to the female officer beside her with her eyes half closed. In front of her there are two noble women are waiting. The stone table is mixed with strange fruits and vegetables. One of the noble women is dignified in appearance, with phoenix eyes and vermilion lips. Her eyebrows are full of small intentions and restraint. She peels a fruit and carefully feeds the old lady to eat it. "Empress how is it you?" The old lady opened her eyes, saw that it was her who handed over the fruit, smiled and said strangely, "Let those children do these things. You are in charge of the harem, the mother of the world. How can you be the one to do these things?" The noble woman smiled gently and said, "This filial piety is something that must be done no matter what." It turns out that this noble woman is now the Empress of Qing. Then she serves this old lady, naturally as His Majesty the Emperor's birth mother, the year's Princess Chang, now the Empress Dowager. Just don't know that sitting on the other side of the woman in palace dress and what is the status, actually can sit side by side with the Empress. No need to read. The Empress Dowager softly instructed the female officials, "All of you retire." All the palace maids retreated, leaving only the two old sisters behind. The Empress Dowager closed her eyes for a while and asked, "What do you think of the few poems you heard from that Fan family child earlier?" The Empress smiled and said, "The child doesn't really understand the highs and lows of words either. It just sounded like it was good." The Empress Dowager laughed and said, "Not only is good, that first have envy of fish love, but also let it be, that after 1,000,000 miles of sadness in the fall often as a guest, but is not the general talent can write out of the just." See, the Empress Dowager stopped talking. The Queen asked, "Just how?" The Empress Dowager sighed and said, Just the sentence in the sad and depressed gas is too heavy, and a young age, how to write this kind of old man flavor. I'm afraid that the child is also a blessed person. Hearing this, the other noblewoman who had been silent all along was actually wailing and crying out, not knowing what was so sad. The Empress hurriedly consoled, the Empress Dowager is only saying this, if that Fan Xian is truly blessed with thin fortune, the Empress Dowager can just pick some blessings under her fingernails and give them to him, and they will be filled up. The Empress Dowager is also the most annoyed with her crying, full of unhappy said, I gave birth to 3 children, the Emperor needless to say, although Li Ji playful, but always also know the sky and happy life, but this is your girl, this crying for decades. Not yet cried to understand, it is really. After all, it is their own biological daughter, coupled with the daughter of this life miserable and unsupported. It is not good to say heavy words. The noblewoman calling cut and weeping said, my child has been a blessed person, the emperor's brother preferred her to marry the Fan family, that more blessed child, which can be how to do in the future. Chin's disease, if there is no improvement, how to do? It turned out that this extremely weak, weeping noblewoman was Fan Xian's possible mother-in-law, Her Highness the eldest princess who had never married. The Empress Dowager finally couldn't help but open her mouth and scolded, the root cause of Chin's illness is because you, as her mother, didn't give her any blessings, and now you still have the nerve to say these things. What happened to the Fan family's child? Once said to give the mourning child wedding, without saying a word, the child from Tanya State to pick up back, not to say that it is also a poor child without a name and no identity, only because of the Fan Jian to our royal heart. You should not say the Fan family is not. Next to the palace maids have long retreated, leaving only a few old sisters standing with their hands tied, as if they hadn't heard anything. The Empress Dowager's angry chest kept rising and falling. The queen rushed up to rub. The Empress Dowager will queen's hand away. Tone slightly slowed down. Some said, besides, the mourning child is always going to be married, her identity. The son of the famous ministers and generals of the dynasty who want to marry to go, but also do not necessarily live well. This Fan what comes? The Empress hurriedly reminded, Fan Xian. Yes, Fan Xian, as you heard earlier, is indeed a talented child. Matching Chin'er is not an injustice to her. The Empress Dowager gasped twice and said, and since His Majesty has already granted this marriage, what's the use of you coming to me to make trouble?